Okay, I think we can start. People will keep coming in, but it's not fair for you all that we're here in time. So we will just start, and I'm sure they will join. During the introduction. So first of all, good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for the interest that you showed in this webinar. My name is Chiara Cosentino, and I'm currently acting director of FGM European Network, where I work in the role of head of policy and advocacy. To give you a brief overview of our organization, FGM European Network is an umbrella organization of 30 national organizations working in 14 European countries, and you can see all our members on the screen right now. And we are the driving force at European level in the European movement to end FGM. And we operate as a meeting ground for communities, civil society organizations, decision makers, and other key relevant stakeholders at European level to interact, to join forces, and to coordinate to ensure a comprehensive and human rights European response to end all forms of female genital mutilation and support survivors, both in Europe and beyond. So it is really in this spirit, and while looking at fulfilling this key main mission that we have, that we are very excited to cooperate with Charlotte Prudman and Annemie Middelberg in this very interesting and important webinar. The webinar of today aims at exploring a protection mechanism developed in the UK, its positive outcomes and some challenges that would be important to address to make it more effective, as well as the possibility of running such mechanism and tool in other European countries. The webinar today is mainly really a space for discussion, for exchange among us, and for mutual learning. With the ultimate goal in mind, to have a common European approach for women and girls affected by FGM, to be able to access the same protection standards, no matter where they live. So indeed, currently, in some European countries have different protective measures in place that Anne-Marie will explain a bit later, but they are very diverse in terms of scope, applicability, implementation, and this really leads to a lack of homogeneity of mechanisms on European soil. So this is really why we are co-hosting this webinar today. So without further ado, I'm gonna present you. I will walk you a bit through the program and the speakers of today, and then we'll start. So the first speaker that we will have is Dr. Charlotte Prudman, and she will give us the perspective of a barrister, and she will introduce the purpose of FGM protection orders, so their history, statistics, example case law. Then we will have Gillian Squires, and she will bring to the table the perspective of a police officer, and she will explain FGM roadshows. And then we will have Lethan Bartolomeo from the National FGM Center, who is also a member of the network, and he will bring us the perspective of a social worker on how really the application of FGM protection orders works in practice. Then we will have Emi Abdel-Shait from Forward UK, another member of the network, who will bring the perspective of the communities and on the FGM protection orders, how it affects them. And then finally, Dr. Anne-Marie Middelberg, she will conclude and bring us to the debate session, really giving an overview of rolling FGM protection orders in other jurisdictions, and really to ensure and encourage an harmonization across the European Union. Yes, and I'm the facilitator, so I will guide you through the presentations, and then Anne-Marie will lead on the moderation of the debate session. So just before starting, some final key housekeeping rules. So please keep yourself muted, and if you can, also with your camera off throughout the webinar, unless you're invited to speak during the debate session. Feel free, of course, to raise questions and put comments and introduce yourselves in the chat box. It's very important for us to have an exchange, so please feel free to write there. And as mentioned in the email, and as you can also see when you enter the webinar, this webinar is being recorded. So if you don't want to appear, please again keep your camera off, change your name, and yeah, do not take the floor, but write in the chat box. That will not be appearing in the recording. And at the end of the webinar, we will share the presentation. So no problem, you will have all the information. Great. So yeah, I think we're all set. We can start. I hope that people joined in the meantime, so they will not miss these amazing speakers that we have today. So yes, we will start with the first speaker, Dr. Charlotte Prudman. She's a barrister at Goldsmiths Chambers and junior research fellow at Queen's College, Cambridge. Having completed a doctorate in FGM law and policy at King's College, Cambridge, she's an expert in FGM law and is currently writing a manuscript for Oxford University Press on FGM laws in the UK. She was instrumental in the introduction of FGM protection orders in the UK and has been instructed in precedent-setting FGM cases before the courts. So, Charlotte, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for that introduction. So I'm going to be speaking today about FGM protection orders, specifically in the British context. So if we move to the next slide, thank you, Chiara. The outline of the presentation is an overview of FGM in Britain, the origin of FGM protection orders, so looking at how it was they came to be introduced, why FGM protection orders are needed, the purpose of them, statistics in respect of FGM protection orders, and then we'll consider in practice some of the relevant case studies and case law, which shows that FGM protection orders have indeed worked to protect young girls and indeed women from FGM. So FGM in Britain, as is the case in many countries, there are no reliable statistics which sets out how many women and girls are at risk of FGM and how many have indeed been cut. We understand, of course, that there is a high prevalence of FGM across the world in a number of countries, and it is thought, according to a study in 2015, that around 103,000 women and girls are living with FGM in this jurisdiction. Now, the NHS does collect data on the numbers of women and girls that they see who have undergone FGM. And according to the data that they've collected between 2015 and 2019, they saw over 45,000 attendances to health services in England by individuals who had undergone FGM. Now, despite criminalising the practice of FGM, that was in the UK in 1985, there has only been one conviction for FGM. This is despite the fact that we understand FGM has continued to be performed, certainly since 1985 and onwards. And we can speak a little bit about some of the barriers for implementing the criminal laws. We know that criminal laws are often punitive, they can be rather draconian, and FGM, of course, as we understand it, is a familial or community-based practice. And so there's often a reluctance for victims, who are often very young, to give evidence against family members or community members. And for that reason, there are a number of barriers to implementing the criminal law. So in many respects, the criminal law hasn't been successful in terms, at least, of prosecuting perpetrators of FGM, but it's unknown in terms of actually how much impact the criminal law has had in deterring the practice. So when looking at legal redress that's available for women and girls who suffered FGM or at risk of the practice, the criminal law appears to fall short. Chiara, could we move on to the next slide? Thank you. So the origin of FGM protection orders. As we've heard, FGM in terms of the criminal legal redress has been rather deficient. And so FGM protection orders were introduced in 2015 in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. They're largely modelled on forced marriage protection orders, which have been around since approximately 2007. And so there has been quite a lot of research onto the effectiveness of forced marriage protection orders. And indeed, they've worked in terms of them being an injunctive remedy, which I'll come on to shortly. So how was it that FGM protection orders came about? Well, in around 2013 to 2014, the Home Affairs Select Committee conducted an inquiry into FGM. The Home Affairs Select Committee worked specifically in Parliament with a number of MPs. And at that time, they were concerned that there hadn't been one conviction for FGM, and it appeared that it was still continuing as a practice with very little support available for women and girls. And so as a result, as a member of the Bar of Human Rights Committee's working group on FGM, which is a group of human rights lawyers, we proposed to this committee that they introduce FGM protection orders. The government agreed, and they introduced them in 2015 under the Serious Crime Act. This subsequently amended Schedule 2 of the FGM Act 2003. And as I've said, we now have FGM protection orders available in the entirety of the UK, with Scotland having introduced them as recent as this year. Legal aid remains means and merits tested, so there can be some challenges in women, girls and other family members obtaining legal aid due to the means and merits test often being quite high. Now, the purpose of these orders is distinct to the criminal law. The purpose is to be a preventative measure to protect a girl or a woman who is at risk of FGM before FGM has taken place. And it's designed to encourage them to seek legal protection without fearing that the family could be subject to criminal sanctions. Thank you, Chiara. So why is there a need to FGMPOs? Well, we've heard that there's barriers to mounting a prosecution. There are difficulties in obtaining evidence to bring about a prosecution. And we know that there has been certainly a handful of failed prosecutions in this country for a variety of reasons, such as difficulties in obtaining evidence to prove that FGM has been performed from a medical context. Now, experience shows that FGMPOs are less punitive than other legal remedies, not only in terms of criminal law, but also care proceedings. So FGMPOs are not care proceedings. So care proceedings are when a girl is at risk of significant harm, or any child in fact, and the state will intervene and often put those children in foster care or will conduct assessments because of the risk of harm, and that could be emotional, sexual, physical neglect. FGM protection orders do not sanction the removal of children by the state into foster care. That is not what FGM protection orders are intended to do. They're intended to protect and safeguard. And I've certainly seen evidence in a number of cases that I've worked on as a result of FGM protection orders being obtained. I've seen families' attitudes, beliefs and behaviours towards FGM change as a result through intensive social care work ordered by the courts. Now, anyone can apply for an order with leave of the court. Victims may not want to involve the police, for example. They could apply themselves, or a family member could apply. And often those individuals remain in the family home when it's safe to do so, unless care proceedings are invoked. Thank you, Chiara. So let's get to the thrust of what FGM protection orders are actually about. So the orders can include prohibitions or restrictions and other requirements to protect a girl or a woman. So they're largely injunctive in nature, so they prevent behaviour from happening that shouldn't happen in any event. So for example, they could be used to prevent a girl or a woman from being removed from the jurisdiction if there's a risk that a girl could be taken from this country, potentially to a high prevalence FGM country where they could be cut. The protected person therefore is subject to a so-called travel ban or travel restrictions. A girl may be medically examined to see if she has been cut, or medical examinations could be used after the end of a family holiday abroad as a deterrent to prevent FGM from taking place. In the majority of cases, it's fairly usual for risk assessments to be ordered. So if there are concerns that FGM could take place, Then risk assessments might be ordered by the court. So for example, the National FGM Centre or Forward, who we'll hear from shortly, may be ordered to carry out an assessment as to whether they think this family could perform FGM and work with them, I've seen, in a very productive and collaborative way to change attitudes towards FGM. And it could prevent contact from taking place with a potential perpetrator. Now, interestingly, such orders relate to conduct outside of England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. So they also relate to conduct, for example, in Sudan or Bahrain or Somalia. They can relate to conduct in any part of the world. Now, it's questionable whether, of course, these orders can be enforceable in those parts of the world, but they often constitute, therefore, a deterrent effect in families fearing, well, if I engage in FGM abroad and then I ever want to travel to Britain or bring the child back to Britain, I could face consequences for breaching such an order. And indeed, a breach of an order at that point can become a criminal offence, up to 5 years imprisonment, fine, or both. Thank you, Chiara. So just having a look at Schedule 2 of the FGM Act, I apologise to those that are not lawyers on the call who probably think that this looks very dense, and indeed it often does appear that way. But I just ask you to really scrutinise and consider Section 1, subsection 2, which is in red. And this is a very important section which is taken from forced marriage protection orders. It's pretty much identical wording. So in deciding whether the court should make an FGM protection order, they will consider all the circumstances, including the need to secure the health, safety, and well-being of the girl to be protected. That's a very interesting and important piece of the Act, because it makes clear that there is no threshold which is required to be met in order for an FGM protection order to be granted. So it doesn't even say here that the girl or woman needs to be at risk of FGM. It just simply says that an order will be granted to secure her health, safety, or well-being. So I always encourage local authorities, if they are concerned about FGM, to make that application. Often there's a real reluctance, and it's thought that in fact there's a high threshold similar to care proceedings, and there's not. And as we've already heard, subsection 4 relates to conduct outside of England and Wales and within England and Wales. So again, reinforcing the fact an order can be taken out abroad. So who can apply for an order? So the individual to be protected, so the girl or woman, relevant third party, such as a local authority, and any other person can apply for permission to make an application. And usually that permission application is just a formality. So mothers, for example, who apply will say, I have a strong connection with the girl or the woman to be protected, and therefore I'm making this application. And leave permission is often granted. And then you move on to the second stage of considering whether the order should be made at all. So the court will make an order for the purposes of protecting someone from undergoing FGM, and it can also be made after FGM has occurred. And we've seen this happen in particular in forced marriage cases. Now in England and Wales, what they've done is they've actually set out which family courts are trained to deal with FGM cases and have the resources available. And there are 23 designated courts, and of course the High Court can hear such applications. Thank you, Chiara. So what are the statistics when it comes to FGM protection orders? Well, we know from the data from the Ministry of Justice that between 2015 and 2019, there are a total of 408 applications made and 489 orders were made. So sometimes multiple orders can be made in one case if it concerns multiple children, even though one application is being made, which can therefore increase the numbers. Or the court may even make an order of its own motion without an application having been made. Now, I think these are fairly decent statistics, and they show the fact that people are making applications for FGM protection orders, particularly considering there hasn't been a huge amount of media awareness about these legal remedies. I think it's rather impressive, particularly when one considers there's only been one conviction for FGM, despite the fact it's criminalised in 1985, and yet we see that these orders are working in terms of injunctive remedies. We don't have statistics on the numbers of care proceedings concerning FGM cases. There has only been, as I'm concerned, 2 reported care proceedings cases, the first one being Re B&G in 2015. Thank you, Chiara. So let's move on to thinking about the case studies and how these actually work in practice. And no doubt we'll hear a lot more about this from the other expert speakers shortly. So let's consider the case study of Rosie. She has a protective Nigerian mother. Her mother, however, has been cut, but she is now against FGM. She has a 16-year-old daughter. She's concerned that her ex-husband may want FGM to be performed on her daughter, and there have been threats that have been made accordingly. As a result, the mother refers herself to social care, so what we call children's services or social services. And social services look into this, the social worker addresses it, and they say, we have no concerns about your parenting, we have no concerns about the need for a risk assessment as such, but we would support the mother in making an application for an FGM protection order. And so the local authorities support her in applying for that order before the court. The father contests the FGM protection order and says this order would affect his career. But regardless of that, the court says there is a risk of FGM and they grant the FGM protection order until the girl is 18. Now, it's unlikely that such an order would affect one's career because it ordinarily wouldn't come up on any police checks, with it being a civil family injunction. And certainly no findings were made to suggest there was a risk of FGM in terms of the father having made threats, but rather the court considered it was necessary to make the order at that stage. Importantly, the girl continued to college and the mother went on to start an MA in psychology. Thank you, Chiara. Now, one of the key landmark precedent-setting cases, of which there are a number concerning FGM protection orders, but for our purposes today, the one that I think is most important is Re-X. This is an important decision. I had the great fortune of representing the mother, a wonderful woman in this case, and she'd had a little girl. She'd given birth to this girl just a couple of years ago now, and the father of the little girl lived in Egypt. Both the mother and the father were married and they remained in a relationship. But the father couldn't get a visa to travel from Egypt to England and Wales. The Home Office simply refused his application for a travel visa. The mother therefore decided she wanted to take her daughter to Egypt to visit the father and the paternal family. So when the health visitor came round to speak with the mother about this trip and how her daughter was getting on, the mother said, oh, I've been reading about Egypt and I see there's a high prevalence of FGM. And she'd also spoken with the father and it was suggested that some paternal family members may have been cut. This raised concerns by the health visitor. The health visitor referred the matter to the local authority, and the local authority, which is in our context, social services, children's services, they applied for an FGM protection order. And they went to the High Court to make this application to stop this little girl from travelling from England to Egypt due to the risk of FGM. Local authority wanted a proper investigation to see if there were any risks and how those risks could be mitigated. The court granted a travel ban, and the court heard a lot of evidence from the paternal family members, from the father, from the mother, from the social workers involved, the health visitor and others. And the court initially decided that there was a high risk of FGM and that the paternal family at that stage, their attitudes were fairly ingrained and it was potentially likely they would perform FGM. And so the court therefore granted a travel ban so the girl could not leave the country until the age of 16. Now the parents appealed that decision to the Court of Appeal, and that decision was overturned on the basis that it was a risk to this little girl in terms of her not being able to see her father and therefore a breach of her Article 8 rights to a private and family life. So the Court of Appeal said, look, this case needs to go back to the High Court, there needs to be another retrial, there's got to be a way around this situation. So the High Court very sensibly ordered a number of further assessments, which I helped to gather. There was a further social work assessment, and more importantly, there was an in-country Egyptian risk assessment, which is one of the best risk assessments I've ever seen conducted abroad. So there were two very senior academics from a social work and anthropology background, one in this country and one in Egypt. They both worked together. The expert in Egypt sat down with the paternal family with a number of sessions, discussed FGM in Egypt and discussed whether they supported it or not. And the expert saw over time that the family's attitudes changed over a number of weeks and months. As a result, the court said there's been some really good social work that's happened here. The risk of FGM is reduced. There's still potentially a risk, so we're going to grant the mother leave to take the child to Egypt for one visit to see her father in 2019 for around 7 days. And I can tell you that that went very well. And the father and the mother and the child were all, of course, delighted to be reunited. And the case continues in terms of looking at what further travel arrangements can take place. Well, REEX is very interesting because it gives guidance on the different factors that ought to be considered when deciding whether a travel ban is made in cases where FGM is a risk. And this is all thanks to FGM protection orders. Without FGM protection orders, this mother could have found her potentially within care proceedings, which are a lot more draconian, particularly given parents often concerned understandably about children being removed from their care. Thank you, Chiara. So in terms of concluding remarks, I'm going to hand over now. But of course, this session is about not only the UK context, but looking at how these remedies can be rolled out to other EU countries. And we'll hear more about that from Dr. Middleberg. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Charlotte. It was really comprehensive, and I think we all appreciate an overview for the ones of us who are not, legal experts or UK experts. So thank you very much for this. I would like to move to the next speaker. Gillian Squires joined the West Midlands Police in 1992 and became actively involved with the force response to female genital mutilation in 2009, becoming the force subject matter expert. Jill completed secondment to the Home Office FGM units in 2018 and 2019, where she devised and delivered 10 multi-agency roadshows across the UK, raising awareness of protection orders. Furthermore, Gillian has been awarded a Woman in Policing Special Recognition Awards for her dedication and pioneering FGM work. And she was invested as well as a member of the Order of the British Empire in 2018 by His Royal Highness Prince Charles. So, Gillian, the floor is yours.
Hi everybody, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you so much.
Can you see me as well? Video is working.
I can't see you right now, but please go ahead. Yeah,
it's probably not a bad thing that you can't see me outside. I'm a bit of a technophobe, so apologies about that. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. As anybody who's listening knows, who knows me, will know that I can speak for England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland in terms of FGM and carry on and then beyond. So to speak in 5 minutes is quite a challenge. But first and foremost, I think it's really important. Most people see the police as prosecutors, ones who are upholding the law. Of course, that is one of our roles, but very much so, we also have a very important role to prevent crime and to protect members of the communities. And if you go back to Robert Peel, one of his principles was about preventing crime. Within the West Midlands Police, we have a vision: preventing crime, protecting the public. And I think protection orders are very much welcomed, as the outlines that members of the community who are affected by FGM are understandably reluctant to come forward to police for a number of reasons, because one of which being they don't want to criminalise their family. So to be able to have a tool to be able to help protect them is really crucial. I think it's important to say as well that in the majority of extras, what we will be looking at in my experience in the UK is that it's usually around children. And in those circumstances, we would be expecting our colleagues within children's services to be applying for those rather than ourselves in the police, because they have the...
Gillian, sorry, your voice breaks a lot. I'm not sure. I think I cannot see the chat box, but I think that a lot of people are having the same troubles. I don't know, Charlotte and Anne-Marie, can you confirm?
Yes, I can confirm, Chiara. It is quite difficult to hear Gillian Squires. I wonder perhaps if she could move maybe to a place with better Wi-Fi connection.
I'm right next to the Wi-Fi.
That's a little better, actually.
Yeah, sometimes it's better. Maybe if you can talk a bit slower, no worries for the 5 minutes. Maybe
okay.
Like this it would work better.
Okay. Do you want me to start from the top?
I think it's fine to continue from there. It only intermittently cut out, but thank you.
Okay. So as police, we would expect children's services to apply for the orders, which they would ordinarily do. But we do work hand in hand as a partnership. Okay, so as you've already mentioned, I was asked by a whole series of roadshows across the UK, which was last year and the previous year, raising awareness of protection orders, because we know that professionals, community members, members of the public aren't aware of the scope and the fact that there are protection orders there available to help. The way I think it helps in terms of policing is that it's about changing behaviour. These orders are around changing behaviour. When we look at FGM, we look at other offences rather than just FGM. We look at potential assaults, we look at harassment, kidnap, threats to kill sometimes. So the orders, we can ask in those applications to be able to give directions to be able to control that behaviour, and should that behaviour be breached, should that order be breached, we can then arrest for that rather than for the concerns around the FGM, which obviously would be sometimes against the wishes of the victim. I think another good thing about the orders is that it's a very, very wide scope. So I've had conversations with judges who will say, if you can think of something that could protect a victim from FGM, every case is different. Ask us, if you think it will protect the person, then ask us exactly, say, evidence why you think that will help protect the individual. And if we believe that that is the case, and if it's within their ability to do so, then they will grant that. So don't be afraid to ask for things which perhaps aren't ordinarily considered as something that might be asked for. As I say, every case is different. Okay, another good thing about the orders is that you can have many respondents. We know that within the forced marriage, honour-based abuse, FGM issues, it's not usually just one person who somebody is at risk from. It's potentially from parents, potentially from extended family, potentially from community members. If we believe there is somebody who is a child, then they can be named as respondents. Doesn't matter how many there are. And equally, as a person to be protected, you can apply for as many people as you like. So it's really important to look at that associated risk. So not just the child you're looking at. Are there any sisters? Are there any cousins? You know, I'll give you an example of one that I dealt with where mum was also protected. Mum had reported to police that she'd been assaulted by her husband. She was estranged from him, and he wanted to take the child to the country in Africa which they came from, and she wanted the girl to undergo FGM. Mum didn't want this. She's been through it herself. She understands how it has affected her life. And so she said no. So because she wouldn't hand over the passports, Dad assaulted her. So she came to the police, reported the assault. When it became apparent what that assault was about, we sought to obtain an FGM protection order. And as part of that order, we asked also that Mum be protected and that Dad be told basically not to be harassing her by approaching her. We can put restrictions in around accessing a certain road or area, those sorts of things, to be able to protect Mum as well from that pressure. So it's really important and really good to be able to consider that associated risk. We must always remember that risk is dynamic. So with FGM, quickly, and equally, it can go away when work is done potentially with the family. It's really important we have the opportunity to be able to vary orders in the court as well, which of course we are able to. Okay, another great thing about the orders, they are very powerful in that where we have children abroad, they have assisted us in repatriating girls who we believe that have been at risk. And I'll give you an example of that. We had an anonymous call into the police to say that they were really concerned about some girls that had gone to an African country in this circumstance in July for the holidays, and were expected back but hadn't returned. And the anonymous call was saying Mum was coming back on her own. She was leaving the girls there because they were going to undergo FGM and she couldn't bear to see them in any pain. So when she arrived back in the country the following day, we'd obtained a protection order, served it on her, and within that order, it ordered that she bring those children back to the UK unharmed within a set amount of days. Now, the children's uncle brought them back into the UK. They were medically examined. They hadn't had FGM. We'll never know whether they were going to have FGM, but they are protected now by that order until the age of 18 years old. Okay, so in conclusion, really, around the challenges that we face, we've got an order, that's great. We've got that protection. Sometimes it can be time limited. Sometimes it can be until further order, which means there isn't really an end date. But for me, the really important thing is about monitoring and making sure that that child or adult is able to disclose if there is a breach of that order. You've heard from Charlotte that a breach is a criminal offence. It can be imprisoned for 5 years. It can also be dealt with civilly. What we need to be doing is making sure that those people professionals who are around that child, so whether that's school, the GP, that they are put on that order, that they are able to have a copy and be informed of that order, so they can keep an eye out, they can monitor, whilst the police and children's services won't be involved with them full time, as for 18 years, for example. They will have other professionals who will be. So it's really important that they are involved so that they know what the order says and highlight concerns should they come across any. I think the audit is a great deal better than it was, but I think there's still a great deal that needs to be done, particularly amongst community members, because what I feel very strongly about is I know that there are many parents who actually are against FGM themselves for their children, but there is still a risk there because they're extended family and community. And as Charlotte said, anybody can apply for an order. And actually parents can apply for an order themselves to help them protect their children. And I think it shouldn't just be seen as something which is negative, but also positive as well. And I think, as Charlotte said, with the child being allowed to go to Egypt for that 7 days to see their father, I think these orders can be varied, and so that no human rights are violated. We don't want anybody to be upset or, they're human rights. We want them to be protected. but we want what's best for them and today. So, is that okay?
Thank you so much, Gillian. Yeah, no, that's great. I think you gave a really important, perspective of the police in terms of really also. I think it's very important what you said about raising awareness of this instrument, and also that every case is different, and so it can really be adapted to the needs of the people, and it should be actually. And then and also the I liked when you mentioned, the importance of adapting and talking and engaging more communities. And I think we're gonna hear this now in the next couple of presentations. So thank you very much for your insights. Yeah, so our next speaker is Listen Bartolomeo. He's the head of the National FGM Center, which is a partnership between Barnardo's, the UK's largest children charity, and the local government association to bring about a system change in how local authorities respond to cases of FGM and other harmful practices. Lethan is a social worker by background, and he has worked extensively on issues relating to safeguarding children, violence against women and girls, and the criminal justice system. So, Lethan, you have the floor. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot. Like Jill, I'm not tech savvy, so I've done something to my screen, so Zoom is, it looks a bit bizarre at the moment. So if I'm not looking at the screen, I'm just looking at another screen where I have the presentation, because I can't see the presentation on this screen anymore.
No problem.
I'm not sure what I've done.
We can see you, so it's
okay.
Perfect.
All right,
Carry
great.
on. Thank you.
If we can start with the second slide, that'll be great. So on this so just taking mine, I can't see what's on the screen, Chiara. So just starting with this second slide here is just a diagram illustrating what the FGM Center actually what we do. I wouldn't go through the entire thing because of time, but I will just point on two things. One is it's around our social work provision. So we have social workers and project workers based within children's services, and they're the ones that are responsible for bringing about that system change in how they respond to cases of FGM. So part of it will be doing assessments and using our FGM assessment tool and writing independent court reports. And the other part of it is around learning and professional development. So it's around delivering training, which would include training on FGM protection orders. So the next slide, I'll just quickly run over that one as well. So this is just where we currently, local authorities, where we are located currently. Right, so next slide, we're looking at benefits. So in a 5-minute presentation, what I just thought it would be important just for me to outline some of the benefits of FGM protection orders, some of the challenges, and then I'll just quickly run through 2 case studies quickly. Now, so at the FGM protection, at the National FGM Center, as I said, so we have social workers based within local authorities. And one of the things that we try to do is raise awareness around FGM protection orders. And so these bullet points here is just some of the benefits based on our casework with families and in local authorities that we have found because of the FGM protection orders. So first thing is that they're very responsive in emergency situations. So if we are concerned about the welfare of a child is at risk of being cut, for example, obtaining the FGM protection orders, it's something that can be done pretty quickly. We can manage the risk if the risk is overseas, and it allows the child to remain safely with the family. So as Charlotte said, is that FGM protection orders does not result in a child being removed from the parent's care. It does, so separation of the child from the family is something that doesn't happen when you get an FGM protection order is granted. Now, interim order could be obtained as well when the risk is unclear. So you're not too sure, that it is met the threshold where there's some concern, for example, and you can apply for that FGM protection order on an interim basis. Now, the order as well could be discharged. So we have been involved in a number of cases as well where we've either reassessed the risk that was presented to the child, or So, for example, the local authority obtained an interim protection order. They commissioned us to do an independent assessment, and at the end of it, we decided, look, that there's no risk here, and we'll make a recommendation for the order to be discharged with, and that has happened as well. So we see that as one of the benefits of FGM protection order. Now the other point is that sometimes when an order has been granted to the local authority, the local authority will then make the decision that the case can be closed. So what that means is that there's no longer the involvement of children's social care in that child or that family's life. Now, so that could be seen as a benefit, because we know that families in most communities really, being involved with children's social care, there's a stigma that's attached to it. And once the order has been granted, it's good that the family feel that the order would support them in being able to protect their child, and there's no need for children's social care to be involved with that family any longer. Now, the focus is really for FGM protection orders, as Jill and Charlotte said, it's really about prevention. It's about being proactive. It's about preventing that child being cut. So for us, that is considered to be a positive thing as well. But with FGM protection orders, there are a number of challenges. So if we can go on to the next slide. Now, we know that Jill just said that last year there was a series of roadshows across the UK raising awareness of FGM protection orders, but also forced marriage protection orders. But in spite of that, awareness of them amongst professionals, communities, and families remains low. So there is still a lot of work to be done around raising awareness. And one of the key professionals that we think, it's the solicitors in children's social care. They're the ones who are giving advice, for example, to social workers. And if they are unaware of the existence of the orders, social workers are unaware of them, they're going to overlook it and probably take steps to get other types of orders, which may seem a bit draconian. Now, a challenge is sometimes getting parents to engage with the assessment alongside the order. So an interim order would be, say, for example, it's granted, but the parents are very upset that an order has been granted. And then to do that work assessment with that family, to assess the risk in much more detail and in depth, the families are unable to overcome the fact that an interim order has been granted. And for some families, the word interim means nothing. An order is an order. And that in itself presents a challenge for social workers to engage with families. Now, so sometimes the order is perceived to be, it does not take into consideration all the risk, and some risks may remain unassessed. So there's this view that once we get the order, everything is all right, this child is protected, when there are other risk factors that's being presented. So it kind of like as well create a default position that once we prevent travel overseas, that means the risk has been reduced and there's nothing that we should be concerned about any longer. Now, for some families as well, where they have left their country because they're being persecuted, for example, they obtain refugee status, they have left the country because of concerns about FGM, and then there is a situation where an FGM protection order has been granted. The family feel that they're being punished twice. One, because what they had to endure in their home country to get to the UK, whether it's FGM related or not. And then when they come here and they're being told that they are presenting their child at risk, presenting the risk to their child. Now, in some local authorities, what we have found is that the response to FGM, sometimes it isn't balanced. And what should happen is that even before they even consider an FGM protection order, there's no discussion about safety planning with this particular family. So there are steps that could be taken before you even consider an FGM protection order. But for some professionals, it's the first resort instead of safety planning, and sometimes it's the last resort as well. Now, one of the biggest challenges for us for the FGM protection orders is it's around how are professionals told about the existence of the order? So I don't know, probably, and Jill could probably mention, there's the Ministry of Justice and probably Charlotte about a pilot. I'm not sure if it's a pilot any longer, but one of the issues is that if an FGM protection order is granted, and they just say it's a child that, let's say, is a 3-year-old, the case is closed to Children's Services. Now, if that child of that family then moves to another part of the country, the case is closed to children's social care, and let's say that child starts school, how would the professionals in that area know about the existence of an FGM protection order? So that in itself is a challenge. And also, who serves the order when it's granted as well? There's been some difficulties around that. Probably Charlotte could talk about that a bit more in detail. And lastly, on this slide, sometimes when the orders are made ex parte, so that means that the parents are not present, and they then find out that an order has been granted, that then results in a fractious relationship between the local authority and the parents, and then makes the assessment difficult. Right, so I know that I probably ran out of time, so if I can just quickly, I wouldn't go through the full details with these case studies, but this first one involved a mother who contacted Children's Services because she was concerned that her child I wouldn't name the country, so it's an East African country, where she was told by the child's paternal grandmother, that she was going to cut the child. The mother was duly concerned. The legal advice was given to the family support worker by the local authority solicitor was that tell mother to go seek legal advice. So they have concerns that this child is going to be at risk. They make no decision about trying to protect this child, who is a British child, and just tells the mum to go and seek legal advice. Now, this family support worker, he knew nothing about FGM protection orders either. And he was surprised to hear that there's actually really a measure that could be put in place to protect this child. And the mum's financial position meant that she couldn't actually travel. We are all in lockdown. She can't enter the country where this child is based as well. And the local authority, as I said, not taking on board the steps that's required. And if they could also apply for an FGM protection order to protect that child. And a last case study, which kind of like touches on what Charlotte mentioned about FGM protection orders being possibly granted on made for a child who's already cut. But this isn't the case in relation to a mother. She was originally cut, gave birth. She disclosed to the midwife that the vagina looks ugly. It resulted in a referral to Children's Social Care, Children's Services, and order was granted with a travel ban because there's risk to this child being cut overseas. A few years go by, the mum was cut, became pregnant, returned to the midwife. The midwife sees that she was actually reinfibulated. That raised concerns, same narrative, vagina looks ugly, refer to Children's Social Care. An interim FGM protection order was granted for this second child with a travel ban, includes the girls not to be cut, names family members as well overseas who present a risk to that child, and also in the UK as well. And an independent assessment was commissioned to reassess the risk towards these girls because the mum's story is that she would not cut her children. As well. So one of the key things in this particular case for us was around how do you assess motivation when a mother or a father has said something previously that's very concerning and worrying. She was reinfibulated, and then when Children's Social Care becomes involved, again, the narrative changes and she says that she wouldn't cut her child any longer, and the father said that as well. So that's one of the key things for us as professionals, assessing motivation. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Lethan. That was really, really informative. And I think that's especially from hearing really from a social worker's perspective, the benefits, as you were mentioning, and then challenges. And I really think you explained very well, the different layers of both benefits and challenges, and also in terms of ensuring that communities do not feel targeted and double punished, as you were mentioning. I think it's quite interesting, and also the fact that raising awareness of professionals on this, and that this should also come not as a first resort, but actually really there should be there can be other steps before resorting to a protection order. So I think that was very, very informative. Thank you so much. Yes, now we will have the intervention of Amy Abdel Shahid. So she specialized in behavioral insights and impact evaluation of health interventions. Amy currently adds evidence and knowledge management at Forward, which is a leading African women and girls' rights organization, using research and evaluation to develop evidence-based programs and policy engagement. Previously, Amy was Associate Director at Cantor Public, where she led the research for the UK central government departments, including Public Health England and the NHS. So, Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chiara. So I just wanted to add to all the speakers that have spoken already, is just to bring a little bit more about perspectives from community and social workers that we spoke to around protection orders and other FGM safeguarding policies in the UK as well. Chiara, if you can move to the next slide. Just to give you a very brief overview, in 2019, Forward and the University of Huddersfield carried out a small pilot study in Bristol City to learn from community members and also some professionals around their experiences of some safeguarding policies in the UK, including touching on protection orders as well. So we spoke to around 25 women and 15 men who come from different types of communities, so Somalia, Sudan, Gambia, Sierra Leone, and others as well. And in this presentation, I just want to bring some of their perspective, and particularly also around challenges and concerns they have around protection orders. So if you can move to the next slide, Chiara. So in addition to the clear benefits of protection orders and some of the very successful case studies around how it can be effective in protecting girls from FGM, there has been some concerns, particularly when we spoke with community and social workers supporting communities around protection orders. And these are kind of outlined here. One was around what is prompting suspicion or risk of FGM. The second is around concerns of how protection orders could potentially cause some harm to families, particularly when there isn't enough grounds or evidence that there is, in fact, a risk of FGM. The third concern and challenge was around families feeling supported throughout the whole legal process when FGM protection orders are granted. And finally is around elements of when FGM protection orders can be terminated once there is less risk that the girl's actually at risk of FGM. So we can move to the next slide. So I'll just break these in with just a couple of quotes to give you a sense of what communities and social workers have been saying about this. So one of the main issues of what prompts suspicion, and one of the main concerns is that sometimes FGM protection orders can be done, as Lethan said, maybe on as a first resort, without enough risk assessment or very strong grounds for suspicion. So for example, we have a quote here from Dina, who's from an Egyptian community. She said that this actually happened to one of her friends. Her child said that she's going on holiday and she's going to have a big party. And as a result, they took her passport and she went to court. She was in and out of court for 3 years based on just the child's words. And she says that she's seen a lot of families who suffer for that particular reason as well. So it's just that sense among communities that sometimes these protection orders are done without enough or sufficient evidence that there was actually a clear risk for the girl to be having FGM. Another element was around that kind of potential harm that can be imposed on families if there actually wasn't a real and strong risk that a girl might be subjected to FGM. So we have a quote here from Gulut from Somali community, who's also saying that his impression or perspective on the protection orders is that they confiscate their passport, they cannot travel, they cannot do anything. They're under watch. If the suspicion was not true, then you damage the whole family. And I think it's the elements that many community members talked about, is the anxiety and stress that communities have to go through when such a protection orders have been actually put in place. So taking that into account and understanding how communities deal with a protection order as well. Another concern or consideration that came out from our research is that families feel unsupported. And we have a social worker that has been working with a lot of families in Bristol who has been going through protection order. So you can click on that. Sure. She was saying that it is frustrating to know that there are families with protection orders who cannot sleep, who are always looking over their shoulders. What's going to happen tomorrow? Today they took my passport. Will they take my girls away next? If you are going to introduce legislations that impact communities, you should have support in place. So it's again talking about how even if protection orders does not mean that that girls will be taken away from the family, it does introduce a very strong factor of fear around what will happen to the family next, the way they're navigating the legal system, the fear that their daughters might be taken away from them. So that element of an anxiety and fear is coming up again, as well around the processes involved in protection orders. And finally, was discussion around the element of when FGM protection orders are in fact terminated. For example, when there has been a lot of educational initiatives happening with that family and the risk has actually been reduced. So another social worker we spoke to raised that point when saying that, when do you let the family go? There's no system where families could get their passport back when they have been educated. This can last until the girl is 18, and that's not good enough. Okay, so we can move to the next slide. Sure. So in light of our pilot research and insights of the kind of concerns and challenges that has been faced by both community members and social workers who work directly with communities, I think there's a few points that we think needs to be considered or maybe fleshed out further around protection orders in the UK, particularly around re-examining, reflecting about what constitutes a real risk or evidence of risk around FGM for a protection order to be granted. And a second point is around identifying support services that are needed to support families through the legal process. So either it's a legal support or even financial support, with some families, for example, who've have paid a lot of money to go on holiday, but then had a protection order, and that meant they lost quite a lot of money without traveling, for example. So it's looking at elements of different types of support that families might need during that time, in addition to also emotional support that they may need. And thirdly is exploring clearer process of how FGM protection orders can be reasonably terminated upon families, for example, receiving educational initiatives or supported to change their attitudes around FGM for the future. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Amy. Thank you very much for this insight in the community's perspective. I think it's very interesting. Also, you know, to see, well, first of all, to see the reactions, of course, and then your key recommendations coming from this pilot study, but also to see that there is probably a lot of miscommunication and unawareness, really, in terms of there is a detachment, you know, between probably the policy and what actually is perceived at community level, because as you were saying, indeed, like in some community members, they don't really know what's gonna happen, and so there is this fear, as you were saying. And I think it would be, it would be just very important to bridge this gap, no, and to really communicate, engage more, and because, of course, and all the speakers said it actually, that this is a kind of, the community aspect is probably the part that needs to be more developed, really, to improve a tool and a mechanism that anyways has a lot of benefits, as we saw from other speakers. But I think it gives, really completes the picture and shows that there is definitely room for improvement, but on a mechanism that needs to be tailored case by case, as all the speakers said. So thank you very much for this really important contribution. Yes, so our final speaker that will then bring us to the debate session is Dr. Anne-Marie Middelburg. She's an independent consultant and lecturer at University of Amsterdam, and she has a background in international public law and human rights, and has a unique expertise on women's rights and the practice of FGM. She obtained her PhD in the field of FGM and founded her own company, Middelburg Human Rights Law Consultancy, in 2015. And she has assignments from the United Nations, European Union, civil society organizations, as well as universities. So Anne-Marie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chiara, for that very kind introduction. And I would like to thank the other speakers as well, because this is a very important topic, and it's also good to have different perspectives on the table today and to have a debate. So I will keep my presentation relatively short in order to also allow all the speakers to react to each other, but also I see in the chat that there are many questions, and I would like to thank also the speakers already for answering many of those questions. So it's very nice to see that the debate has already started in the chat box, and after I shared with you my short presentation, we will continue this debate in person. So I would like to share with you how I came involved with FGMPOs. So as Chiara said, I work as an independent consultant. I have an academic background, and when I was asked to write a background paper for UN Women, UNICEF and UNFPA on FGM, promising practices following a Human Rights Council resolution, I came across the FGMPOs. And then I conducted interviews with all stakeholders in the UK who were involved in FGMPOs, and I became very, very interested. What I would like to highlight as well is that there is a proven track record now of FGMPOs in the UK. So as Charlotte already mentioned, it was introduced in 2015. Also important to realize is that the idea came from good experiences with forged marriage protection orders. So we first had that in the UK, that worked really well, and then FGM protection orders were introduced as well. What has been highlighted already by the previous speakers, but I would like to say this again, it is a legal means to protect and safeguard victims and potential victims of FGM. So it's really important to keep that in mind. It is also a civil order, so when legal experts speak among themselves, sometimes this can be very confusing. And I noticed that when I speak about FGMPOs, very often people also confuse it or think that it is connected with criminal law, but that is not the case. So this is a civil order by a high court or a family court, and it's not an alternative to the work of the police. For example, it has nothing to do with prosecuting crimes. It is a civil order to protect girls at risk. Next slide, please. So what we see in international human rights instruments and obligations of states, the needs and safety of women and girls affected or threatened by FGM should always be a priority. That's not only what I believe, but that is what is written in legally binding human rights instruments. what do states need to do, who sign up to treaties, international conventions? We know the due diligence principle. We need to prevent FGM, we need to protect victims of FGM, we need to prosecute its perpetrators, the Ps. Now, what is nice about FGMPOs is that it prevents FGM, but you're also protecting victims of FGM. Next slide, please. So if we go back to, because I would like to show a larger picture in the European context. So if we go back in history, FGM appeared on the agenda of the EU and the Council of Europe in the 1990s. There have been many instruments adopted ever since by the EU, by the Council of Europe, different directives, the Victims Directive. There are many directives that are relevant in case of FGM. There are many resolutions that have been adopted and also many action plans. Now, the Victims' Rights Directive is a very important instrument that says that every victim of crime is entitled to be recognized, respected, and receive adequate protection, support, and access to justice. And in this Victims' Rights Directive, it is very important to harmonize EU member state legislation. No. Please mute yourself.
It's locked.
It's blocked. The toilet is blocked. Chiara, can you move to the next slide, please? So what is also important to know, so apart from the more general obligations to protect, to prosecute, it is also important to realize that Article 53 of the Istanbul Convention requests states, so state parties shall take the necessary legislative and other measures to ensure that appropriate restraining or protection orders are available to victims of all forms of violence. And we know that FGM constitutes a form of violence against women. So also the Istanbul Convention actually proposes an obligation on states to introduce protection orders. Next slide, please. Now, when you look at what is happening in EU countries, so we had the presentation of the other speakers who presented the situation in the UK. Now, what is the situation in other European countries? Are women and girls protected? There have been various studies on the prevalence estimations in the EU. And those studies show that there are many girls at risk of FGM in EU member states. On top of that, we also know, unfortunately, that we are not able to protect girls and women at risk of FGM in the EU. There is evidence that girls are cut in their countries of origin during school holidays when they visit family members, community members in their countries of origin. So there is a problem here. Now, what I noticed over the past year is that there is a lack of knowledge on the existence of FGMPOs and also a lack of knowledge on how it works. As I already mentioned, there is a confusion with criminal law proceedings. There is a lot of resistance in relation to the duty of professionals to report cases to the police. But I hope that we can make clear in this webinar that FGM protection orders are a different type of, offer a different type of protection to girls and women at risk. Now, this is a list on this slide of child protection measures that are already existing in different EU countries. So some of those measures are with court permission, so you need to go to court in order to get a measure like this. Some are not. Sometimes social services are involved, child protection services are involved, sometimes this is not the case. So what you see in the European context is that the landscape is very scattered. It really matters where you are, what type of protection is offered to you as a girl when you are at risk of FGM. And I think this is very worrisome from a common European perspective. So here you see a list of measures that have been taken in cases of when girls are at risk. As Charlotte, but also the other speakers mentioned, not all these measures can be covered in FGM protection orders, but I just wanted to show you what type of measures are currently being taken in other EU countries. Chiara. So I would like to conclude that there are many differences in terms of protection offered to girls at risk of FGM in different European member states. To my mind, there is a clear need for a common European approach. And this is not only the case for FGM protection orders. I think there is a similar issue, and I don't want to touch upon that in this debate today, but for example, in relation to asylum. So it really depends whether a mother claims asylum in the Netherlands, for example, or in Belgium. The protection offered the protection offered in different member states is different. And I think this is a fundamental problem that we need to address. So this is also the case, for example, in relation to reconstructive surgery, which is covered by health insurance in some European countries, but not in others. And there are many other issues that are at stake, but I think also in terms of protection offered to girls at risk, a common European approach is necessary. I think the example of the UK clearly shows that it is an effective legal remedy to protect a woman or a girl at risk of FGM. It is a promising practice, and to my mind, it should be rolled out to other jurisdictions. And having a bit of knowledge about other jurisdictions, other legal systems, I do see a real nice opportunity to really roll out, follow the example of the UK, to roll it out in other jurisdictions in the EU in order to protect girls in a more effective and also in a more systematic manner. So that was my presentation. What I actually would like to do now is to first give the floor to the speakers, because I noticed that there are many questions in the chat box that I also would like to address. But Chiara, if that's all right, I would like to give the floor first to the first speakers, so they can maybe shortly react or respond to some of the things that have been presented or have been shared. And then we come back to the questions in the chat box.
Sure.
Yeah. So maybe Charlotte, would you like to react to everything that has been said after your presentation? Do you have particular questions perhaps to some persons? I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Middleberg. I found your presentation incredibly interesting in terms of looking at what the next steps are. And as you say, this obligation upon EU member states to introduce protection orders, and of course to ensure that there is sufficient legal redress to prevent and protect girls and women from FGM. So I think it seems that there is an avenue here that hasn't yet been filled by existing legal remedies in different member states, which, as you say, are not always consistent and harmonised. I'd like to hear more from any EU representatives who might be on the call who could speak to that and potentially speak to how that could work. In terms of the presentations, I thought they were all extremely interesting from different perspectives, hearing from a police perspective from Jill, social work and National FGM Centre perspective from Lethan, and Amy's very interesting research that's taken place through Forward. I can speak as a barrister representing women and girls in FGM protection order cases, of which I've done an overwhelming number now. And it's important to note that it's often women, mothers in particular, that will apply for FGM protection orders because they want to protect their children. And we know in asylum cases in particular, where women and girls may be applying for asylum because of the risk of FGM back home, for example in Sudan or Somalia, that they may apply for FGM protection orders. So if they are returned, those orders can be enforced in their home country. And in fact, we've had a lot of success with that. So it's important to note that FGM protection orders are not always applied for by public authorities, and in many cases are applied for by mothers. And I've just recently finished a Court of Appeal case, which was a landmark decision in a case which overlapped with asylum law and FGM protection orders. where a mother was supportive of the local authority applying for the FGMPO because she was worried her family would cut the children if they were moved to Bahrain or Sudan. So this was very much community driven by her community at large in the London area. In respect of forwards research, I'll be very interested to learn how many of the 24 people that they interviewed had actually been subject to FGM protection orders. I've worked on many other cases, certainly more than 24, and I haven't, I have to say, come across cases where women and girls have told me explicitly that they feel that they are targeted, stigmatised or marginalised as a result of FGMPOs, even when they've been applied for on behalf of public authorities, and in fact have welcomed the support that's been available to them. I mean, you mentioned, I think, one interesting example about a friend who was heard from another friend in the community about FGM protection orders, but I'd be interested to know how many have actually been subject to these orders from the cases you've worked on. I should also add that I carried out my PhD, as Chiara mentioned, at King's College in Cambridge, and I interviewed over 79 individuals that have experience in FGM protection orders and FGM law and policy, including women and girls from a variety of different high prevalence countries. And I interviewed as well within focus groups 22 Somali women. And of all the legal remedies that we discussed, they were broadly supportive of FGM protection orders because it provided legal redress without the criminal sanctions necessarily being attached. So I've seen nothing but positivity from those community members that I've directly worked with, not only in law, but at a grassroots level. And you also mentioned as well, which I thought was quite interesting, a social work perspective, this suggestion that families were worried that their children could be taken away. I mean, it seems to me from what Lethan has had to say that that's quite a poor social work response. One would expect, and certainly acting on behalf of local authorities, that the social workers will provide them with reassurance that children can never be taken away when they're subject to FGM protection orders. That's merely a myth and a fallacy. It never happens. They'd have to apply for care proceedings. So perhaps some training for that social worker and others would be imperative to make sure that families are not concerned to that extent. So I'd like to know a little bit more about your research, please. But thank you all so much for your contributions. It was fascinating to hear from a variety of different backgrounds.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you so much. Maybe Amy, do you want to respond to a few of the questions that Dr. Proudman asked? Are you still with us?
Sorry, yes, I am. Sorry,
Yeah.
I missed this last question. Can you just repeat it quickly, please? Sorry.
Well, one of the questions was how many of the 24 people had been subject to FGMPOs, or how many people of your research? I think that's a very relevant and important question to address.
Yes, because we didn't, anyone that in our research did not have particularly direct experience with protection orders, and that's why we're not really showing case studies around that. In terms of social workers, they are social workers who work directly with community members who's had experience of protection orders. So their perspective is coming from direct experience supporting community members dealing with or going through the legal process of protection orders. In terms of the perspective of communities, as we always know, experiences in the legal system or around safeguarding regarding FGM tends to have a lot of conversation and emotional emotional engagement from community members, because they are quite tight communities. They learn from each other, they know from their neighbors. And what we wanted to show in this presentation is to bring about that perspective of what people perceive about protection orders and what it actually is, even if their perception might not be 100% accurate about what actually happens in reality. It still shows how the knock-on effect of one experience of protection orders can even have effects on other community members living in fear or living in a bit of anxiety or distress about what's happening to another member of the community. So it's bringing that perspective, even if they didn't have a direct experience with protection orders themselves.
Thank you for that clarification. Maybe Jill, do you want to respond to any of the, I saw that you addressed many of the questions in the chat box already. Is there anything you would like to share with the audience, or do you perhaps want to react on certain presentations?
Hi, thank you. Just a couple of things, I think, really. I'm very conscious of the fact that we don't want to alienate communities. We absolutely don't. We want to work with them to protect them. And I'm really concerned about the lack of knowledge around the protection orders out there for them. However, what I would say is that on the Ministry of Justice and Home Office websites, there are some leaflets around protection orders which are available in about 12 different languages. So anybody who wants to explain it further, who hasn't perhaps got access to the English language, have a look on there. Whenever I talk about protection orders or serve one on someone, I will always provide one of those in the relevant language with it. It is key that we build trust and confidence. My concern, I suppose, is that when we're looking at the voice, we absolutely need to listen to the voices of the communities. But sometimes I'm very conscious that there's only so much that we can disclose to others who aren't party to the proceedings. And so sometimes individuals might only be only have access to kind of a small part of the evidence available in that case as to why the order was given. And what I don't want is for communities to feel threatened or feel that we're stigmatising them. I think it's just really important to understand that very often the whole picture won't be known. Also, in terms of the courts and their giving of the orders, making the orders, the judge has to be satisfied that there is a real risk of harm. If they are satisfied that there is a real risk of harm, then they will grant an order. What I would also say is that that order will be reviewed. That the judges, believe me, are there to make sure that the best thing for that child and that family is made available. And if an order isn't required, if there isn't enough evidence there, then they won't grant that order. And I have personal experience of being challenged in the box in family court about certain things within an order. They are very, very thorough, and very much they want, obviously it's a court of protection, it's the best thing for that family, and making sure that their human rights, their basic human rights, are not impinged.
Yeah, I think it's important that you shared that, Gil. Thank you so much, because that was also one of my questions when I started diving into the FGMPOs. Like, to what extent, since I am a human rights lawyer, to what extent are human rights being guaranteed by the FGM protection orders? This was also a question from the Human Rights Council. So I think it's very important that you address that. I think it's also a good idea, Chiara, if we share the links of all the documents that Gil referred to, because I think it's important to share more knowledge and more information about the FGMPOs with everybody, with professionals, with academics, with people working for NGOs in all different sectors, because it's important that, you know, opinions are not based on I've heard this, or, you know, people say this, but that we can actually read what is an FGMPO, what is following from jurisprudence, how does it work. I think that is indeed very, very important. Leighton, I also would like to give you the opportunity to react. I saw you answered many of the questions in the chat box already, but maybe you would like to take the floor now to react on some of the questions that have been raised or some of the issues that were presented.
Okay, great, thanks. Just to respond to what Charlotte said, I don't think in any of the cases that we have been involved in, well, in none of the cases that we've been involved in, and I'm not sure if I said that during in the case study, the presentation, that ever resulted in a child being removed from a parent's care when an FGM protection order has been granted at all. I think that there are a number of key themes from all of the presenters, but also in the chat box as well, when we look at the questions being asked. And one particularly is around communities feeling stigmatization. I think that it's just to echo what Jill said, is at no point along this journey of ending FGM, new cases of FGM by 2030, do we want communities to feel stigmatized, because that means that we're going to, there's going to be a setback, even though that the 2030 target is obviously a very ambitious one. And one of the key things for us at the FGM Center, because, and you saw Charlotte's stats, and we've been involved in something like 38 FGM protection orders, which would put us, the National FGM Centers, the organization that's been involved in most FGM protection orders have been granted in the UK. So we do have a lot of learning to share. And one of the key things is that, that someone may apply, an agency may apply for an FGM protection order unilaterally. But for us, the most effective orders, once they're granted, would work when there's multi-agency working and sharing of information across the safeguarding partnership as well. So in multi-agency response, it's really important. Now, one key question as well is that has been asking is, what support is there for families once an order has been granted? Now, it all depends, sadly I would say, depends on which local authority, where you're based and what services are available. But in most cases, if an FGM protection order is granted and the case will be, in some situations will be close to the local authority, and parents could be signposted depending on what support is required. But we do know that it depends on where you live, the quality and the number of FGM, number of agency providing FGM support. They're very much few and wide between. So if a mother, for example, wants therapeutic support, there are very few agencies out there, organizations with that expertise and being able to provide that therapeutic intervention. And in some local authorities, some areas of the country, there might be a long waiting list as well. So it obviously all depends on what support would meet the individual needs for that family. Just looking at the issue about why is it that communities are unaware of FGM protection orders, and also professionals as well. Now, the thing about it is that when a social worker is allocated a case, that might be the first case that they would have been allocated on FGM, and say that their career over a 10-year period. And sadly, it's only when you're allocated a case and it's presented in front of you, you will probably start to do a Google search or want to talk to colleagues about this particular case that you have. So it's not really at the forefront of professionals' mind. So one of the things that we try to voice is that think about intersectionality that FGM features with other types of cases. So it might be a case involving domestic abuse. You need to think about FGM. You need to think about, parental mental health. Does FGM actually factor in the woman's story, or this woman's narrative? And so we try to get the professionals to explore wider issues in much more detail. And you will start to see FGM cases or issues with what women or girls encounter. It features within cases, but I don't think that we're there yet. We're far removed from that, because people just automatically think just FGM and not the wider issues as well. And what I would say as well is that if you can go to our website, so the National FGM Center, if you Google it, there are a number of resources. We do have a leaflet for communities, for parents on FGM protection orders as well. And, you subscribe to our leaflet, our newsletter, sorry. I mean, Charlotte has written a number of articles, one on FGM protection orders for us as well. And you can access it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lethan. time is running out. I can talk about this for another hour or two, and I bet many of you as well. I would like to thank you also, the participants, because we're with so many still to bear with us. I would like to hand over back to Chiara, because time simply ran out, and we need to close down now.
Okay, but I think what I think it was a very interesting, I'm sure that in the chat, I couldn't follow, but I'm sure that in the chat it was a very important and interesting debate, and I really love, you know, that we brought so many different perspectives to the table, and even among the speakers, there was, you know, debates and answers, and I think it's such an important topic, protection and prevention of FGM, that definitely there is, you know, not a perfect solution, but I think that we can really, you know, ensure that, I mean, and say that definitely FGMPOs are a good and promising practice, as you were saying. And I would really say that to really make it even better, like communities should be, you know, even the leaflet of the National FGM Center, or definitely there should be more dissemination about that, and also professionals and communities should be really more aware, not to fear, and definitely not to feel stigmatized. And on the other hand, of course, also authorities should refrain from stigmatizing in cases, I mean, you know, in some cases it could happen potentially, but I think that definitely it's a tool that we would really want to explore more, and really to see it in other European countries. Yeah, so I mean, just to conclude, okay, these were the questions, but I'm sure that, you know, we can give you all the PowerPoint, and we received some cases, so maybe we could even share those cases with you to reflect, and who knows, maybe we can organize another webinar really to debate more about how can we roll it out, or how can this apply to other countries. But yeah, we just wanted to say thank you so much for this, and please stay in touch, of course. And that was great to have such an amazing attendance, and such an amazing, you know, pool of speakers with all their perspectives, and we will share definitely all their, you know, links to researchers, to papers, and to websites, and everything, but so that you can really have an important overview also, and get a bit the knowledge of the amazing speakers that were with us today. So thank you so much to everybody, and yeah, enjoy the rest. Thanks to the speakers, absolutely. Thanks to Anne-Marie and Charlotte for proposing us to you know, to do this jointly. And I wish you a lovely evening and afternoon, and hope to see you soon around online, definitely. Bye bye. Take care.